Hey everybody, this is um, the preface to Dialectical Materialism, a historical and systematic survey of philosophy in the Soviet Union by Gustav A. Vetter, translated from the German by Peter Heath. I remember this book being praised in Z.A. Jordan's book on the same topic. The table of contents for the book are preface, translator's note, and part 1 of the book is titled Historical. Chapter 1 is titled The Philosophical Roots of Marxism. 1. Hegel. 2. The quote Hegelian Left. 3. Ludwig Feuerbach. 4. Marxism and Positivism. Chapter 2 is titled Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. 1. Karl Marx. 2. Friedrich Engels. Chapter 3 is titled Revolutionary Movements in Russia, the Origins of Russian Marxism. 1. Origins, Russian Nihilism. 2. Narodnichestvo. 3. Russian Marxism. Chapter 4 is titled The Philosophical Tendencies in Russian Marxism Before the Revolution. 1. The philosophical conflict between Marxism and Narodnichestvo. 2. Criticism in Russian Marxism. 3. The quote God Seekers and the quote God Builders. 4. Bogdanov's Imperiomonism. 5. Plekhanov. Chapter 5. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. 1. Life and Philosophical Activity. 2. Leninism. Chapter 6. Philosophical Developments in the USSR up to 1931. Chapter 7. Mechanism. 1. General character of mechanism. 2. Bukharin. 3. Axelrod, (orthodox). Chapter 8 is titled Menshevik Idealism. 1. General outlines. 2. Deborin. 3. Trotsky. Chapter 9. Development since 1931. 1. Consequences of the decree of the Central Committee of the 25th of January 1931. 2. The Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences. 3. The quote philosophical discussion of 1947 and its aftermath. 4. From the quote philosophical discussion quote to the death of Stalin. Chapter 10. Stalin as philosopher. Chapter 11. Since the death of Stalin. Part 2 of the book is titled The System of Soviet Philosophy. Chapter 1 is titled Conception of Philosophy. 1. Philosophy and the Special Sciences. 2. Individual philosophical disciplines. 3. The unity of theory and practice. 4. The partisan character of philosophy. 5. The philosophical quote atmosphere and quote in the USSR. Chapter 2 is titled The Theory of Matter. 1. Materialism or Realism? 2. The Leninist concept of matter. 3. Matter and motion. 4. Space and time. Chapter 3 is titled The Materialist Dialectic. 1. Stalin's account of the first 2 quote principal features and quote of the Marxist dialectical method. 2. The law of the transition from quantity to quality. 3. The law of the unity and struggle of opposites. 4. The law of the negation of the negation. Chapter 4. The Theory of Categories. 1. Appearance, essence, and law. 2. Causality and finality. 3. Necessity and contingency, the problem of freedom. 4. Possibility and actuality. 5. Form and content. Chapter 5. Dialectical Materialism in Modern Science. 1. Quantum physics. 2. Relativity theory. 3. Mass and energy. 4. Chemistry. 5. Cosmogony. 6. The origin of life. 7. The quote new cell theory end quote of O.B. Lepeshinskaya. 8. The quote new theory of inheritance end quote I.V. Michurin and T.D. Lysenko. 9. Anthropology and Psychology. I.P. Pavlov. Chapter 6, Dialectical Materialist Theory of Knowledge. 1. The priority of matter over consciousness. 2. The, quote, copy theory, end quote. 3. Practice as the foundation of knowledge and criterion of truth. 4. Objective, relative, and absolute truth. Chapter 7. Logic. The materialist conception of logic as a theory of knowledge. 2. The controversy over formal logic. 3. Individual logical operations. Conclusion. Preface. The present work is the outcome of a course of lectures originally delivered by the author in the summer of 1945 at the Papal Oriental Institute in Rome, in which, as part of a more general survey of the history of Russian philosophy, he had to deal with the pre-revolutionary Russian Marxism and with Soviet dialectical materialism. From these lectures, then, there sprang the first version of this book, which was published in Italian in late 1947. One second. Footnote here. Or not a footnote, excuse me, endnote. I don't know where these endnotes are. God damn it. Let's see. God damn it. You little bastard. Okay. Well, moving on. We're reading in the dark. It was followed in 1952 by a very extensive revised German edition, which had to be reissued in unaltered form in 1953 and 1956. The present English translation is based on the text of the fourth German edition, now in the press, which has again been very thoroughly revised and supplemented with new material. The doctrinal edifice of Soviet philosophy is divided into two parts, dialectical and historical materialism. The author has here had to confine himself to the first of these, namely dialectical materialism, including the philosophy of science, in effect to the properly philosophical portion, as the term, quote, philosophy is understood in the West. Historical materialism, oh, there is footnotes. God, I'm stupid. God, I'm dumb. Okay. Historical materialism, which in Soviet usage includes the theory of society, could not be dealt with as such. The problems of ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophies of history and law are also assigned, under the Soviet scheme of things, to the field of historical materialism. There would certainly have been some justification for enlarging the scope of the account to some extent and bringing these subjects also within our purview, since in Western usage, at all events, they undoubtedly rank among the philosophical disciplines properly so called. The reason why this has not been done is that the author originally hoped later on to be able to follow up the volume on dialectical materialism with a second volume on historical materialism, and because lack of both time and space have compelled him to this self-imposed restriction. The present revised version of the book differs in the first place from the previous editions of the German version in that the historical part has been carried up to the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU, February 1956. In the systematic part, the chief need was to take account of the changes wrought by the de-Stalinization campaign. These have consisted chiefly in a revision a reversion from the Stalinist account of the theory of dialectic to that of Engels, and a corresponding rehabilitation of the law of the negation, together with the theory of categories and certain philosophical problems raised by modern science. The chapter titled Dialectical Materialism and Modern Science has therefore been completely rewritten and very much enlarged. The section on the unity of theory and practice has been rewritten almost in its entirety. In working over the remaining chapters, however, the author has been compelled by technical considerations of publishing to limit himself more severely, and to depart less extensively from the earlier text. It was therefore proved impossible to revise these portions as much as he himself would have wished. The author thinks it important to point out that he has had to limit himself to the Soviet account of dialectical materialism as the subject matter of his inquiry. The first effect of this is to exclude the philosophical writing of Western communists, which take their inspiration largely from Marx's early writings. The latter are quite consciously and definitely set aside in Soviet philosophy. And short of embarking on an endless task, it has also meant omitting the philosophical literature produced in the Russian zone of Germany, the satellite countries, and Red China. Nor has it been feasible to enter here into the complex problem of Titoism. The treatment is divided into two sections, historical and systematic, but the main emphasis falls on the latter, systematic. The historical chapters are really designed only to provide the necessary background for understanding the systematic part, and make no sort of claim to consideration as an original historical inquiry into the philosophical development of Russian Marxism, still less into the origins of Marxist philosophy generally. The main object, in fact, has been to provide an ordered selection of documentary evidence sufficient for an intellectual showdown with Soviet communism. But if such a showdown is not to degenerate into a futile babble of conflicting monologues, the first endeavor of both parties must be to understand the other. This calls from the outset for strict objectivity in presentation of the opposing viewpoint and readiness to acknowledge positive merits wherever they are to be found. One could wish at this point that the Soviet participants in the discussion had also adopted this attitude. There has indeed been a great deal of talk there recently of the need for more serious study of, quote, bourgeois philosophy and science, but the object of this has been merely in order to, quote, refute them more effectively. Willingness to acknowledge their elements of truth and to learn from them can be found at best only in the scientific field, and this primarily on the grounds of practical interest. This aim accounts for the predominantly expository character of the book. It has also explains its tendency to a certain diffuseness for which the author craves indulgence. The essential features of Soviet philosophy could certainly have been quite fully set out in a far more concise fashion, as has been done by Bochensky in his excellent book. Footnote: I am Bochensky, der Sowjet-Russische Dialektischer Materialismus. One second. Actually, looks like it is actually J. M. Bochensky. Okay. Awesome. Back to the text. Where the hell am I? Okay. But owing to the Hegelian terminology of dialectical materialism, a compressed account of this sort can easily leave the reader with an impression of something, quote, deeper, lurking beneath the individual formulae of this philosophy. Only on a more thorough examination of the philosophical attitudes and arguments propounded in Soviet dialectical materialism does it become evident that this is not the case. More especially does the author believe that only a more detailed account can justify his opinion that in present-day Soviet philosophy there's very little left of real dialectics, and that it consists rather of a materialistic evolutionism decked out in dialectical terminology. So far as the author has adopted a critical attitude in the systematic part towards individual tenets of dialectical materialism, he has been guided in principle by the endeavor not to set out from any preconceived philosophical position, but rather to criticize so far as possible from within. If in spite of this, his criticism has often run in an almost compulsive fashion along Aristotelian and scholastic lines, he would again attribute this to the fact that owing to the above-mentioned disappearance of true dialectic from the conceptual scheme of Soviet dialectical materialism, the individual categories have again taken on the values they had in the pre-idealist scheme of things, which goes back to Aristotle. And hence that Soviet philosophy has come to share a common pattern of concepts with the Aristotelian and scholastic tradition, a situation to which we shall revert in more detail in the conclusion. The author regrets that only after completing the text of this new version did he come into possession of the communist rejoinder to the first German edition of this book, which appeared recently in East Berlin, and that he has therefore been unable to deal with the counter-arguments it contains. He would also wish to beg the kind indulgence of the English-speaking reader for having been virtually unable to take account of the exceptional wealth of English literature on the subject, but he hopes by his treatment of original works in Russian to have rendered a service even to the English-speaking student which may somewhat mitigate this defect. Finally, he would like at this point to express his heartfelt thanks to all who have assisted him in the preparation of this English edition, and more especially the translator, Mr. Peter Heath of Edinburgh, for his able and devoted collaboration in a lengthy and troublesome task. Rome, November 1957. Translator's note. Russian spellings have been, quote, anglicized throughout, with the usual anomalies and exceptions for well-known names, foreign authors, etc. I am grateful to Mr. Dennis Ward of Edinburgh for help in this matter, though he is not responsible for any remaining mistakes. Also to Mr. V.G. Kiernan for the loan of books, and to Mrs. F. Brody for her skill and endurance in typing the manuscript. P.L.H. I guess it's the translator's name. What was the translator's name? Peter Heath. Thank you so much for listening.